I was a signals intelligence operator, stationed at a listening post carved into the side of a frozen ridge. My job was simple: monitor enemy chatter, log activity, and relay patterns. But one morning, I intercepted something no encryption could explain. Both armies were transmitting the same prayer, ending with the same phrase: "The Seven are watching." Who were the Seven? Why did everyone retreat at dawn? And why did the broadcast start using my voice? That was the day I stopped hearing the enemy and started hearing something else listening back. We were deployed in the Khyber highlands, where the mountains tore through the sky like broken glass. The outpost was barely more than a metal shack with antennas stabbing the wind. My shift began at 0300, cold, silent, endless. I'd been intercepting encrypted enemy transmissions for weeks, mostly coordinates, movement orders, and the usual propaganda. But on March 12th, the frequencies changed. The first thing I noticed was the rhythm. It wasn't Morse or code. It was too measured, too deliberate. 7 short bursts, then a pause, then a low hum, like someone breathing into a microphone. I logged the pattern and played it back through the spectrogram. The waveform looked human, like a voice was trapped inside it. When I reported it to command, my supervisor, Lieutenant Daniels, told me to mark it as weather interference. His tone was sharp, almost defensive. "Forget it, Ramirez. We've had weird echoes in that sector before. Just move on." But I couldn't. That night, I tuned back in. The same signal, same sequence. 7 bursts, then silence. Only this time, the silence didn't end. Through the static, I heard faint whispers, like men speaking through cloth. I caught fragments: Ridge, Watchers, Dawn, 7. And then a voice, clearer than the rest, whispered my name. I froze. I hadn't transmitted my identity on any open channel. The systems were air-gapped, sealed. There was no way anyone outside our comms room could know I was there. I hit record and replayed the transmission, but in the playback, nothing, just wind. The next morning, Daniels handed me a sealed envelope marked Protocol 12. Inside were handwritten directives. 1. Do not intercept transmissions during dawn. 2. If vertical silhouettes are observed, do not photograph or transmit data. 3. Do not acknowledge direct communication. 4. Maintain radio silence for 12 minutes after sighting. 5. If you hear your name, log out immediately. 6. Report all dawn anomalies to Command North. 7. Never track them beyond line of sight. 8. Never, under any circumstances, transmit coordinates of the ridge. 9 through 12, redacted. No one had ever mentioned Protocol 12 before. I asked Daniels where it came from. He just said previous operators didn't last long enough to ask. At 4:37 the next day, I saw it for myself. Our cameras pointed toward a ridgeline half a mile east of our post. Visibility was low, thin sheets of fog sliding between the peaks. Then, as the first trace of dawn split the horizon, the fog parted. 7 figures stood there, perfectly still, perfectly aligned. I thought they were soldiers at first, scouts maybe, but their outlines didn't move, didn't shift even when the wind gusted. The thermal cameras showed nothing. No heat, no heartbeat, just voids shaped like men. Then my radio came alive. Enemy frequency, different language, but the message was the same tone. Urgent, terrified. Their commander was ordering a retreat. Every unit near the ridge was to pull back immediately. And as our systems recorded the broadcast, I noticed something horrifying. The transmission time codes were identical to our own. Both armies had broadcast the same message at the same second. Daniels rushed in, pale. He slammed the monitors off and ordered me to delete all data. When I refused, he leaned close and said, "You think you're the first one to hear them?" That night, I woke to static pouring from the intercom. I pulled the headphones on. It wasn't random noise this time. It was me, my own voice, recorded earlier, whispering back Protocol 12 line by line, except it didn't stop where the redactions were. It kept going,
Rule 9, it said. When they look back, don't blink. Rule 10, if they enter the base, they already have. Rule 11, do not check the personnel count. And then, softly, Rule 12, you're already broadcasting. The screen flickered. The thermal feed showed 7 shapes inside the compound. By the time we sealed the comms room, we realized the transmission wasn't coming to us anymore. It was coming from inside.
When the alarms went off, it wasn't because of an intruder alert. It was the system itself rebooting. Every monitor in the comms room turned to snow, each screen flickering between static and flashes of the ridge outside. But the ridge wasn't being filmed in real time. The timestamps were 2 hours ahead. Daniels and I stood frozen as one feed stabilized. 7 figures again. Same formation, same ridge, only now 1 was missing. 6 remained. He didn't say a word. He just grabbed the emergency key and locked the door. "No one opens this room," he said. His voice was trembling. "Do you understand? They're mirroring us." I didn't understand what he meant. Not yet. I checked the personnel log on our base network. It showed active signals from our outpost's identification tags, but there were only 6 of us stationed here. When I pointed that out, Daniel slammed the laptop shut. "Don't check the personnel count," he muttered. "That's Rule 11. That's when I realized something terrifying. The rules weren't just arbitrary safety guidelines. They were written to contain contact. At dawn, the fog crawled down the ridge again. The air pressure in the room dropped, as if the mountain itself was exhaling. I watched through the narrow glass slit of our bunker door, and that's when I saw him. A man in full combat gear, walking out of the fog toward the outpost. His face was hidden behind a visor, but the uniform, it was ours. Daniels whispered, "Nobody goes out there." The man walked right up to the gate and stopped, just stood there, his visor tilted slightly upward, directly toward the comms room window. I blinked, and he was suddenly closer. Daniels cursed under his breath, yanked the power lines down, and pulled me away from the glass. He turned on the emergency beacon, but it didn't light up red. It flickered blue. That's the color reserved for internal code breaches. Our radios crackled. A distorted voice came through, barely human, as if someone was speaking through water. "Unit Echo 7, open the door." It wasn't a voice from the ridge. It was my own. Daniels lost it. He started tearing out the power lines, ripping every connector from the mainboard, screaming that we weren't broadcasting anymore. But when he pulled the last cable, every monitor in the room flared to life again. All 7 figures back on screen, this time inside the perimeter fence. Their bodies flickered like projection ghosts. "Get your weapon," Daniel said. "They move if you don't look." But by the time I grabbed the rifle, I realized something. The feed wasn't showing the ridge anymore. It was showing our room. I could see myself standing there, gun in hand, staring at the monitor, and behind me, 6 figures, perfectly still. I turned, but there was nothing there. The room was empty, except for me and Daniels. Then the radio crackled, and I heard Daniels' voice whisper, "Rule 10, Ramirez. If they enter the base, they already have." The air temperature dropped instantly. Frost began forming along the glass panels, spreading over the electronics. The fluorescent lights dimmed to a dull blue pulse, syncing with the hum of the radio. Daniels pointed toward the locked door. Through the small window, we could see shadows moving. Too tall to be human, too smooth. They glided, not walked, like smoke pressed into shape. Then came the sound. A low, droning frequency that vibrated in my chest like a heartbeat out of sync. Daniels looked at me with wide eyes. "That's not them," he whispered. "That's the mountain." The droning grew louder. The lights flickered. The glass cracked. I grabbed the backup drive with the logs, shoved it into my pocket, and followed Daniels toward the maintenance tunnel beneath the base. As we descended the ladder, the sound faded, replaced by silence.
And then I heard it again. My name, whispered right behind my ear. I spun, flashlight shaking in my hand. Nothing. But on the tunnel wall, frost patterns were forming. 7 vertical shapes, just like the ones on the ridge. Daniels bolted. I followed, the cold biting through my gloves. When we reached the sub-level exit, he stopped and pointed upward. Look! The fog had reached the valley floor. The ridge wasn't visible anymore. Only a faint glow pulsed through the mist. Blue, rhythmic, like a heartbeat. Daniels whispered, "They're coming for the transmission." That's when I realized something we'd missed from the start. We never intercepted their signal. We'd been amplifying it.
When we reached the secondary comm station, half the equipment was dead from the frost damage. The radio dials were frozen in place. Even the backup generator's ignition wouldn't click. Daniels kicked at the casing and shouted over the static, "They've hijacked the signal chain! They're in the loop!" He wasn't talking about hackers. He meant the Ridge Watchers. The signal, that low, droning pulse we'd heard earlier, wasn't just sound. It was data. It was feeding back through every antenna, every relay tower, using our own comms systems like nerves in a living body. I didn't believe him until the analog spectrogram on the monitor started forming shapes, not random spikes, but figures. 7 vertical bands, oscillating in unison, each emitting at a slightly different frequency. It was the same formation seen on the ridgeline, and each frequency was pulsing with what looked like breathing. Daniels looked at me. He said, "We're not listening to a signal. We're listening to them thinking." Then came the voice, not from the radio, from inside the headphones. Low, slow, words drawn out like underwater whispers. "Observer 6, standing by." Daniels ripped his headset off. I froze because that was my call sign. The spectrogram twitched. Then 6 of the vertical bands vanished, leaving 1 still moving. The console lights flickered. The temperature dropped even lower. "They're isolating you," Daniels said. "They think you're one of them now." I backed away, but the intercom on the wall, the one connected to every other outpost, suddenly came alive. 7 separate voices spoke in perfect sync. "Protocol 12, synchronize observation." The bunker began to hum. Dust shook loose from the ceiling. Outside, through the frozen slit of the window, the fog began to move. Not drift, but rise, as if drawn upward by invisible strings. It lifted until it formed a flat sheet across the ridge, glowing faintly blue under the first light of dawn. That's when we realized what Protocol 12 really meant. It wasn't an order to retreat. It was a call to align. Daniels shoved me toward the emergency hatch. "We need to destroy the relay. If the signal loops again, it'll replicate the transmission to every station on the grid." We climbed to the surface through the maintenance shaft, frost crunching under our boots. The fog was thinner now, but the world felt silent. No wind, no comms chatter, no birds, just that pulse vibrating through the ground like the mountain itself had a heartbeat. Then we saw them, 7 silhouettes standing along the ridge, perfectly still, but they weren't just standing. They were facing us. Daniels aimed his flare gun and fired. The light burst across the ridge, illuminating the figures, and that's when I saw their faces. They were ours. 7 soldiers, frozen mid-expression, not dead, but preserved in perfect posture, eyes open, skin glistening like glass. Daniels whispered, "That's Alpha Team.
The first recon unit sent here, the one that vanished months ago. Before we could react, the ground rumbled. The ridge itself began to shift. It wasn't an avalanche. It was as if something massive beneath the mountain was waking up. The fog snapped back down, enveloping us in total whiteout. I could feel it pressing against my suit, hear whispers bleeding through the static in my earpiece. Observer 6, observation complete. I ripped off my headset, but the voice was still there, not from the equipment, but inside my head. Daniel screamed that we had to cut the main array, but I couldn't see him through the fog. Just faint blue light moving around me. 7 shapes circling, too slow to be human. Then one stopped directly in front of me. I raised my rifle. My scope picked up a distorted reflection, not a face, but a void, bending the fog inward. And then, just for a second, I saw what was beneath it. It wasn't human. It wasn't even alive the way we understood it. It was a form of memory, suspended in electromagnetic noise. The mountain itself storing its dead. The voice whispered again, "If you see them standing still, don't blink." I didn't blink. But when the fog cleared, the ridge was gone, and the monitors back at base showed something worse. The figures weren't on the ridge anymore. They were inside the compound.
When the fog lifted, it didn't feel like the world had returned. It felt like we'd stepped into something else's version of it. The snow was gone. The ground was smooth glass, every tree, every rock coated in a thin, crystalline shell that reflected our own movements half a second late, like reality itself was lagging behind. Daniel stared at the ridge, where moments ago the 7 figures had stood. It was empty now. But on the comms relay screen attached to his wrist, the motion sensors inside the compound were flashing red, every single one. "All sectors breached," he said quietly, "except the command room." That was 300 meters away, uphill, through open ground. I turned toward him. "You said they can't move when we're looking." He shook his head. "That's not what the rule says." I remembered Rule 5 from the old Intercept logs, one we never understood. Do not maintain line of sight for longer than 12 seconds. The rule didn't mean they couldn't move while seen. It meant we weren't supposed to watch them move, because that's how they spread. The fog began to reform around the glass-coated rocks, each thread pulsing faintly blue. I raised my weapon and aimed toward the main structure's silhouette, lights still flickering behind the windows. Daniels whispered, "Run." We sprinted uphill. Every footstep echoed unnaturally long, like the sound was being replayed by the air itself. I counted under my breath. 1, 2, 3. By the time I hit 12, I couldn't tell if the crunching behind me was my own boots or someone else's. We reached the command door. It was sealed, the keypad screen covered in frost. Daniels ripped off a glove, pressed his hand against the metal, and hissed in pain. The frost burned like acid. Then, from the other side of the door came a sound, not a knock, a tap, rhythmic, 7 beats. I turned my rifle to the door. I said, "Someone's alive in there." Daniels looked up, eyes wide. "No one's alive in there. That's the observation code." The tapping stopped. Then came the voice, muffled but clear. "Observer 6, synchronize." The door mechanism clicked. Slowly, the seal lights changed from red to green. Daniel shoved me aside. He shouted, "Don't move!" But it was too late. The door slid open. Inside, the room was dark, except for the central console glow. The walls were lined with containment pods, 7 in total, each one filled with frozen mist, pulsating like a heartbeat.
and in the center of the room stood a man in a navy parka, the same uniform as ours. He turned slowly toward us. His face was pale, expression frozen in half a smile. Daniels raised his gun. "Identify yourself." The man tilted his head, then spoke in my voice. "Observer 6, confirmed." I froze. My breath fogged the air. My own voice echoed back, distorted through static. Daniels fired. The bullet hit the man square in the chest and shattered him like glass. Shards scattered across the floor, evaporating into mist. Then every containment pod around us began to crack. A low hum filled the room, vibrating the air like pressure before a storm. The mist within the pods turned dark, not gray, but black, the kind of black that eats light. Daniel shouted over the roar, "They're not physical, they're frequencies. We gave them shape." I grabbed the backup drive from the console and yanked it free. "We have to shut it down." But as I turned, the mist surged outward. It poured across the floor, climbing the walls, filling the air. My headset came alive again with the same 7 overlapping voices. "Protocol 12, complete. Observation is now mutual." Daniel screamed as the fog wrapped around him, his silhouette glowing blue, flickering, fading. For a moment, I saw his face melt into static, his features replaced by mine. Then he was gone. Only his headset remained on the floor, repeating the same words in a loop. "Observer 6, synchronize." The room trembled. The glass cracked under my feet. I bolted through the open hatch, clutching the data drive, and ran down the corridor toward the generator tunnels. Behind me, the command room collapsed into itself, imploding silently, like space folding inward. As I reached the lower levels, the power grid began flickering erratically. Every light pulsed in sync with that inhuman heartbeat. I checked the wrist monitor and froze. The compound's internal sensors were showing 7 heat signatures, all moving toward me. The closer they got, the clearer the pattern became. They weren't chasing me, they were positioning. And the formation they were creating matched the exact layout of the mountain's ridges.
I reached the lower levels, steel corridors echoing with distant groans, like the mountain itself was breathing. The wrist monitor kept flashing the same layout, 7 moving points forming a pattern that didn't make sense until I zoomed out. They weren't surrounding me, they were aligning. Each one was settling at fixed intervals across the map, forming an arc, the exact shape of the ridgeline above the base. That was when I realized it wasn't a chase. It was a reconstruction. They were mapping the terrain through me, through every sensor still connected to my suit, every signal broadcast through my comm unit. I was the transmitter now. The thought hit me like a gut punch. The observation protocols we'd been following weren't to monitor them. They were training us to become part of their network, the final step in whatever cycle this was. A faint voice crackled in my headset. "Observer 6, maintain position. Synchronization in progress." It was my voice again, calm, robotic. I tore off the headset and crushed it under my boot, but the voice didn't stop. It came from the intercom now, from the walls, from the floor beneath my feet. "Maintain visual. Confirm alignment. Confirm." I grabbed the emergency lamp and ran. My breath fogged in the freezing air as I stumbled into the generator bay, a cavern of turbines and steel pipes half buried in ice. The glow from outside filtered in through cracks in the ceiling, turning the mist inside the room an eerie blue. At the center of the bay stood the main relay tower, the heart of our surveillance grid. Every observation record, every intercepted transmission pulsed through that tower before being sent back to headquarters. And now it was humming. The panels vibrated,
lights flickering in a rhythm I recognized. 7 pulses, 12 intervals. The same signal that started this. I approached carefully, gripping the drive I'd ripped from the command console. If I could connect it to the relay, maybe I could overwrite the signal, stop the spread before it reached the outside world. Then I heard movement, soft footsteps on metal grating. I raised my rifle. "Who's there?" A beam of light cut through the mist. Someone stepped out from behind the turbine, wearing a standard-issue parka, headset glowing faintly blue. Daniels, but he wasn't breathing. His skin shimmered faintly, like frost on glass. His eyes were blank white. "We finished it," he said, in a voice layered with static. "We've become what they were trying to understand." I backed away, heart pounding. "Daniels, you're dead." "No," he whispered, observed. His mouth didn't move when he said the next part. It came from everywhere. "Join the ridge." The tower behind him blazed with light. The mist thickened until I could barely see. Then, through the glow, I saw the 7 figures again. Not outside this time, but projected inside the fog. They stood in their exact formation, heads tilted slightly upward, as if staring through the ceiling toward the mountain above. And I understood. They were never on the ridge. The ridge was a boundary, a mirror surface where 2 sides of something met. They were reflections of observation itself, entities that only existed when looked at. Daniels raised his hand toward the tower, motioning me to do the same. He said, "You've already been chosen. Observer 6 isn't a rank, it's a replacement." I looked at my reflection in the steel wall and froze. My face was flickering, frame by frame, replaced by the same expressionless silhouette that had haunted the ridges. I dropped the drive into the relay slot and hit execute. The whole chamber shook as code scrolled across the screens. Signal interruption, override initiated. The mist screamed. That's the only way I can describe it. A deep, tearing sound like metal being dragged across stone. The figures convulsed, their bodies distorting as the light fractured. I felt my head splitting, voices whispering in overlapping tones. "Do not break observation. Cycle incomplete. You are the 7th. I pulled my knife and jammed it into the relay's power conduit. Sparks exploded. The lights burst. For a second, everything went white. When I came to, the relay was dark. The mist was gone. The only sound was the faint hum of the backup generator kicking in. Daniels was gone. No bodies, no footprints, just frost where he had stood. I climbed out of the base hours later, following the emergency tunnel to the ridge. The dawn was breaking, soft light spilling over the valley. It looked normal again, silent, peaceful, until I raised my binoculars toward the far ridge. There they were, 7 figures, perfectly still, perfectly spaced, watching me. I lowered the binoculars, took a shaky breath, and looked with my naked eyes. The ridge was empty, but in the reflection of the glass lens, they were still there. And one of them had turned its head toward me. When I returned to base command weeks later, I found my own debrief report already logged, signed as Observer 6, and attached was a new protocol packet labeled The Ridgewalkers, Phase 2. By the time I made it back to the regional command center, my skin still burned with cold, and my mind buzzed like a broken radio. The medics said it was altitude sickness, exposure, and psychological fatigue. They had no idea. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the ridge, 7 shadows standing motionless against the dawn. And in that moment before sleep, I'd feel the hum again, low, rhythmic, crawling behind my eyes. I told myself it was trauma, that it would fade, but then the transmission started. It began 3 nights after my return. My quarters were small, soundproof, deep inside the command facility. I woke to a faint clicking, steady, mechanical, coming from my radio even though it was turned off. When I leaned closer, the static cleared, forming a whisper that made my stomach twist. Observer 6, continue transmission. Ridge alignment incomplete. I unplugged the radio. The voice continued for 10 more seconds before fading into silence. The next morning, I went to the communications division to check the archives. Every base keeps signal logs, timestamps, origins, and encryption traces. But when I asked to review them, the tech sergeant just stared at me. That information's restricted, sir. Higher level clearance only. I have that clearance. He hesitated, then turned his monitor toward me. On the screen was a live feed, 7 bright nodes pulsing on the frequency map. My blood ran cold. They were arranged in the exact pattern from the ridge. We've been picking up these echoes for days, he said quietly. They don't match any known emitter. Each pulse lasts 12 seconds, always at dawn, always at 12-second intervals. 12 intervals, 7 pulses, the same numbers from the observation protocols. That was when I knew the signal wasn't just confined to that valley. It was spreading through the grid, through us. That night, I found Daniel's voice again in the walls. The speakers in my quarters, silent for hours, crackled to life just before sunrise. "You shouldn't have broken the relay," he whispered. "Now they're reaching for new observers." "Who are they? What do they want?" "To be seen. And you're their lens." I didn't sleep after that. I started digging. I pulled every classified folder I could access, back through 70 years of archives. Buried between Cold War projects and abandoned radar tests, I found it. Operation Ridgewatch, an intelligence initiative from 1959. It wasn't designed to monitor enemies. It was designed to observe persistent formations of unknown origin along high-altitude ridge lines during electromagnetic surges. And the final line of the document chilled me. Observation maintains containment. Do not interrupt the cycle. The realization hit me like a hammer. By destroying the relay, I hadn't stopped them. I'd broken the very thing keeping them confined. That same night, the fog rolled in over the base, not just outside, inside the ventilation system, seeping through corridors. The alarms blared. I grabbed my gear and rushed to the communications tower. The power grid was fluctuating, lights flickering like heartbeat pulses. Then, through the static of the PA system, came a single transmission on every channel. A calm, monotone voice repeating a phrase in Russian, then English. 7 align, 12 remain. I reached the control room and froze. The main viewing window faced the ridge, the same one where we'd seen them. And in the fog outside, illuminated by the red emergency lights, stood 7 figures. They weren't moving. They were mirroring us. Every time I shifted, one of them tilted its head in the same direction. Perfect synchronization. The comms officer screamed, firing through the glass, but the bullets never hit. They just disappeared into the mist like it was absorbing them. Then one of the figures stepped forward, and the sound returned, that deep electric hum that made the room vibrate. Equipment failed, radios melted. The observation monitor showed only one thing: my own face, reflected 7 times over. I realized the truth in that moment. They weren't entities from outside. They were echoes of us, shadows recorded by decades of constant surveillance, copies given shape through the repetition, through the act of being watched over and over, until the signal became flesh. Daniel's voice came one last time, whispering through the static. "You've learned to see through our eyes now. That's how they cross." I slammed the emergency broadcast terminal and sent one last transmission to every connected frequency and range, NATO, civilian, even enemy channels. "If you see 7 figures at dawn, don't watch them, don't transmit. Don't look! Then the lights went out. When I woke, I was outside the base, face down in the snow. No bodies, no fog, no sound. Just a single earpiece lying beside me, still active. Observation complete. Phase 2 begins at sunrise. I looked up at the horizon and saw 7 silhouettes forming again in the distance, perfectly aligned with the ridge. Days later, that same broadcast I sent out, the warning, began repeating worldwide. Not by us, by something else, and every transmission began with my voice. It's been 23 days since the incident at Ridgewatch Base, and the world hasn't been the same since. The first reports came from Norway, ham radio operators picking up faint whispers on shortwave channels, then pilots over the Himalayas, truckers in the Rockies, fishermen off the Alaskan coast. Same pattern, same phrase. 7 align, 12 remain, and then my own voice, not just similar, identical. Down to the breath. Every frequency that carried it would distort for exactly 12 seconds before returning to static. It was like something was using my voice to synchronize, to calibrate. I was flown to a debrief facility outside Washington. They locked me in an isolated chamber, white walls, no windows, filtered air. My job was to cooperate fully, but the people asking the questions weren't intelligence. They were something else. They didn't ask about the figures. They asked what I'd heard. When you saw them, did they speak? Did the signal come from inside your head or through the equipment? Did you feel the need to respond? Every question made me realize they already knew. They weren't studying me, they were monitoring me because I was still receiving the signal. Even in that sealed room, I'd wake to that low hum in the air vents, the rhythm, 7 beats, pause, 12 seconds of silence, then 7 again. It wasn't sound, it was something deeper, vibrating through bone. When I told them that, they increased the lighting to full brightness and switched to infrared observation. That's when one of the cameras caught it. Faint heat signatures hovering behind me. 7 vertical shapes, barely visible, forming and fading like ghosts in thermal light. That night, they sedated me. When I woke, there was a mark on my forearm. A faint circular scar that hadn't been there before. It looked like a burn, but the skin around it was cold to the touch. They told me I'd undergone a decontamination scan, but my reflection told a different story. My pupils weren't normal anymore. Under UV light, they shimmered, pulsing faintly in rhythm with the signal. Somewhere inside me, the watchers had left their imprint. I wasn't the only one. I saw them during the transfer, men and women from other bases, eyes hidden, escorted by armed guards, each one moving in rhythm, like their steps were perfectly timed to an invisible metronome. No words, no emotion, just synchronization. They called us Echo-class contaminants. And then one night, I realized the broadcasts weren't external anymore. They were being generated by us. Every time I thought about the ridge, about those 7 figures standing still against the dawn, the hum would start in the speakers. My pulse synced with it. My thoughts aligned with it. I wasn't transmitting a signal. I was the signal. That's when I made my decision. If they were using me as a relay, then the only way to stop it was to shut down the source, me. During a storm that cut external communications, I escaped containment. I don't know how far I got before I collapsed in the snow, but I remember seeing 7 faint lights flickering through the blizzard, matching my heartbeat. And then, just before I blacked out, one of them stepped forward, not a shadow this time, but a perfect reflection. My face, my voice, my posture. Observation complete. Phase 3 begins at sunrise. I woke in a safe house weeks later. No ID, no rank, just a message burned into the wall above the desk. You can't delete what's been recorded. Now I sit here typing this into a disconnected terminal, The hum hasn't stopped. It never stops. It's quiet right now, like it's listening. Outside, snow falls in perfect rhythm. 7 flakes hit the window, then pause for 12 seconds before the next wave. I've come to understand the truth. The watchers aren't coming. They're awake. And the world's eyes, satellites, drones, cameras, every lens are their new ridgelines. Every time we record, every time we observe, they align a little more. The process repeats. The transmission spreads. If you're hearing this, if you've seen those 7 figures on a mountain, a radar, a screen, you've already become part of the relay. Don't look for them. Don't track them. Don't remember them. Because the moment you do, they start watching through you. And when the dawn comes, when the hum begins again, you'll realize the truth. I did too late. They were never outside the signal. They are the signal. That's the last thing I'll ever transmit. But if you think this story ends here, it doesn't. Because yesterday, a reconnaissance drone over Greenland picked up the same 7 formations, not in fog, but under the ice. YouTube thinks you'd want to see what happens next, and they're right. Watch the next transmission before it's deleted.